Number 10. THROG. Starting the list off light. He might be small, but he's still pretty mighty. THROG wasn't always a frog. In fact, at one point he was a human named Simon Walterson. He ended up getting help from a witch, but after being unable to pay her, found himself transformed into a frog. Don't you hate when that happens? He befriended Thor back when he was also transformed into a frog by his brother Loki. The two teamed up to help a frog king defend against an army of rats. Simon would go on to become his own version of Frog Thor after a piece of Mjolnir was broken off. This tiny piece was wielded by Simon, who decided to become his own version of the hero while in his frog form. As a frog, he goes by the name Puddle Gulp as well. Puddle Gulp. So if you ever see Puddle Gulp or Simon, that's THROG. Hey. Number 9. Thunderstrike. While Eric Masterson isn't more powerful than 616 Thor, he was still pretty powerful in regards to general power. He was considered worthy enough to wield Mjolnir and for a time was merged with Thor, in essence becoming that hero. However, he's probably better known for his time as Thunderstrike, when he wielded an Uru-crafted mace. He was fairly short-lived as a character, but whether he was Thor or Thunderstrike, he had powers similar to other Asgardians while in his transformed state. He was super strong, durable, tough, quick, and had a healing factor. In addition to that, with his Thunderstrike mace, he was also capable of teleportation, possibly on a multiversal level, which I think is pretty powerful. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you are loving our channel, be sure to show some love for us by heading on over to Facebook and giving us a follow over there. Number 8. War Thor. War Thor is the name that Volstagg took when he became Thor. This all went down during the time that Jane Foster was Thor and the usual 616 Thor was simply known by the name of ODIN-SON. Volstagg became War Thor due to him seizing the Mjolnir of an alternate reality, which was unclaimed. This version of the hammer, however, seemed to have some kind of effect on his mind, as it made him, kind of violent and severe in comparison to how Thor would usually act. Probably hence his name War Thor. After light elf refugees were attacked by fire demons from Muspelheim, he ended up going to Muspelheim itself, actively taking on the whole realm in battle and threatening to wipe out all life there with a massive flood. Jane Foster as Thor was forced to fight against War Thor and eventually managed to ascertain that he was Volstagg, using her friendship with him to calm him down. Number 7. MCU Thor. Thor in the MCU is pretty powerful, although he still seems to be on a journey towards becoming the most powerful he can ever be within this universe. Recently, he grew quite a bit when it came to his power levels, as he was forced to find a new way to harness his power when separated from Mjolnir, which was destroyed by his sister Hela. Hela destroys Mjolnir at the beginning of Thor Ragnarok, forcing Thor to channel the power within himself, and earning him the nickname of Sparkle Fingers from the Grandmaster. Since then, Thor lost an eye, but managed to protect his people against Hela and the inevitable destruction of Asgard via Ragnarok, using this prophesied end to basically defeat his sister. So although Asgard is destroyed, it lives on in Asgardians. Yay! Thor was unfortunately no match for Thanos in space, although he did actually almost defeat Thanos in Infinity War single-handedly, although I guess in the end he didn't. However, he did go on to find a home for his people under the leadership of Valkyrie on Earth, creating sort of a new Asgard, if you will. We don't know where he's off to next, but it is possible we could see him take up the mantle of leader from Valkyrie, finally accepting his own fate as the next Allfather and inevitably taking Odin's place. That is after he goes on some adventures with the Guardians of the Galaxy, I'm sure. The Asgardians of the Galaxy? Number 6. Ultimate Thor. Ultimate Thor was an interesting version of the character. He hails from the reality of Earth 1610, and initially we were led to believe that this alternate wasn't actually even Thor, but instead was just a guy who kinda like thought he was Thor and was possibly suffering from delusions, who was named Thorleif Gorman. He had a suit which helped him to fight against his enemies. Over time, it would be revealed that Thorleif Gorman was indeed the latest incarnation of Thor Odinson, as memories came flooding back to him. This version of Thor wasn't as reliant on Mjolnir as some other versions of Thor are, which makes him in some ways more powerful. Also, that suit. Number 5. Jane Foster. Simply known as Thor, and for a time known in terms of her series as Mighty Thor. While we know this version of the character was actually Jane Foster, at first in the comics it actually was a mystery as to who the woman behind the hammer was. Jane Foster became Thor after Thor Odinson was deemed unworthy, with the hammer actually calling out to to her. This was also at a time that Jane was sick with cancer, so she had to be strong in many different ways. And it was exceedingly impressive that she decided to remain as Thor, considering the revelation that each time she transformed into the hero, her body was actually cleared of all toxins, including her chemotherapy treatments. Meaning that every time Jane became that hero, she in essence went back to square one with her treatment, making her sicker and sicker over time. Jane even chose to continue being Thor when her life was at stake, and she did end up dying, sacrificing herself to protect the world against Mangog. Fortunately, she would be resurrected by Odin afterward and become known as the hero Valkyrie, which is also like a really big moment for Jane Foster, since Odin, up to that point, never really liked Jane. He was always giving her a hard time. Number 4. Herald of Thunder. This version of Thor folks will be most familiar with, probably from the game Fortnite. But he's actually inspired by Donny Cates' current run on Thor, who exists in main continuity. So even if you're like, Herald of Thunder, that's a Fortnite thing. It's actually also a comics thing. Just like in the comics, Thor is convinced by Galactus to join up with him, as a threat greater than Galactus is apparently on its way, known as the Black Winter. The Black Winter is literally a cosmic sort of, well, winter storm that in essence destroys everything it touches with its snowfall. So, like snow, but if it was like a whiteout for existence instead of just, you know, small frozen bits of water. Much worse than snow. In the game Fortnite, Thor agrees to join Galactus in his fight against Black Winter and becomes his Herald of Thunder, becoming imbued with the power cosmic. Number 3. Rune King Thor. Rune King Thor, although often referred to as an alternate version of the character, is actually from the main continuity. He's more like a very distinct period in time in Thor's life, which ends up in essence getting somewhat reset. In other words, he's kind of main continuity, kind of alternate continuity. What makes him so powerful? Well, this is a version of Thor who comes to be because he's facing Ragnarok and looking for a way to stop it. He ends up gaining the power of the Odin Force and rune magic as well. He gains the Odin Force after Odin dies. Again, Odin has died a lot. Then there is a whole tangential reality that ends up being created where this Thor rules Earth, but I guess technically that's also like now an alternate future version of this version of Rune King Thor. So yeah. Oh boy. Anyways, this Rune King Thor would not be able to avoid Ragnarok in the end and would end up being reset as a result of all of the death that was part of that whole colossal event, along with the other gods and goddesses of Asgard. So that's why Thor isn't quite like Rune King Thor right now in the main continuity, despite this version being a part of the main continuity. Because yeah, he like lost both his eyes. So, lost both his eyes, and yet Thor, I think, is back to having both his eyes. He lost both his eyes, then he had his eyes, then he lost an eye. Does he have both of his eyes back now? I don't know. I can't keep track of how many eyes Thor has. Changes all the time. Number 2. All-Father Thor. While many people still say that Rune King Thor is one of the most powerful versions, and he definitely is, I think the real power lies in a potential alternate future version of Thor known as Old King Thor or All-Father Thor, or simply just as King Thor. Any of these names is acceptable and correct. So if you've heard someone say one and you're like, wait, which one is it? It's all, there's like literally 15 to 20 names actually this character goes by, so they're all right. This version of Thor was once believed to be the true future of Thor, but has since been relegated to kind of an alternate future, with him hailing from the possible future of Earth 14412. Although this Thor has alluded to the fact that if 616 Thor was to die, it would actually affect him, so not sure how connected they are still. In this reality, Thor would not only defeat Gorr the God Butcher, Galactus, a souped up version of his brother Loki, a souped up version of Doctor Doom, and an even more powerful returning Gorr the God Butcher, but he also at one point wielded the Phoenix Force. This all went down after All-Father Thor faced off against Old Man Phoenix, his friend Logan, who had become the host of that force. While Thor lost that fight, the two ended up teaming up together to save Earth from a version of Doom who was super power boosted by various artifacts and powers that he'd been collecting. In the end, Phoenix sacrificed himself to pass on the power of the Force to Thor so that he might stand a chance in defeating Doom, which he ultimately did. Number 1. Herald of None. Herald of None is technically the Thor we have in main continuity currently. This is a period in Thor's life where he basically took all of Galactus's power in order to defeat Black Winter, going from his herald to kind of like renouncing Galactus and ultimately defeating him so that he might destroy the Black Winter, which threatened the existence of everything in the multiverse and the multiverse itself. Doing this allowed Thor to be successful in taking out Black Winter, reducing it to a mere snowflake, one single snowflake. This snowflake also allowed Thor a glimpse into a potential future when it melted on his hand, where he saw Thanos had returned, leading perhaps an army of undead Marvel heroes who were under his influence as he wielded an Infinity Stone encrusted version of Mjolnir. I don't know if we know yet about this future, when it's coming to pass, but I love when comics are like, look at this future, this could happen. I'm like, oh, I'm so excited. Give it to me, give me this future.
Coming in at number 10, we've got Thor's dad himself, Odin the Allfather. Now, given that Odin is the one that put the worthiness requirement spell on Mjolnir in the first place, it kinda makes sense that he'd give himself a loophole and allow himself to be considered worthy, and is shown to be able to wield the hammer multiple times over the years. However, the most notable might be the incident that caused him to add the worthiness charm to the weapon in the first place, when Odin had first created the weapon but found its power too great for him to control safely. Outraged and spiteful, Odin basically roared, "If I can't do it, no one can," and locked Mjolnir away until it eventually became Thor's. Talk about an overly dramatic origin story, am I right? At number 9, we've got the unbeatable Squirrel Girl, a character that honestly doesn't really need Mjolnir, but heck, I guess if she can lift it as well, then she's on the list. Squirrel Girl is a fan favorite character who exists on the sidelines of the Marvel Universe, rarely taking part in major events, but yet has somehow managed to easily defeat practically every major supervillain that's encountered her. Given how powerful she is, the only opponent who's really ever given her trouble is an evil clone of herself. When the Squirrel Girl clone had already taken out the Avengers and threatened to take over the world with a squirrel army, the original Squirrel Girl picked up the fallen Thor's hammer and used it to defeat her evil self. Coming in at number 8, we've got a worthy X-Men in the form of Rogue. Now, since comics history can be a bit convoluted, this storyline actually happened when Rogue and her power-absorbing skills were allied with the Brotherhood of Mutants, and she was a much more villainous character than she is these days. In an alternate universe what-if storyline where Rogue went even more to the dark side, Rogue was able to defeat the other Avengers by touching Thor's skin and absorbing all of his powers, including the ability to wield Mjolnir. Although eventually she would decide to use her new powers for good and save Asgard from another supervillain's schemes, it was still quite shocking to see that Rogue's mutant ability can allow her to literally wield the power of the gods. At number 7, we've got to go with the god of mischief himself, Loki. Now, there are plenty of alternate universe storylines where Loki is Odin's preferred son to Thor, or in which Loki is gifted the ability to wield Mjolnir, but one of the most interesting versions of this story actually occurred in the mainstream Marvel universe. In the Axis event, during which many heroes and villains had their morals and alignments completely inverted, a newly heroic and selfless Loki had to face off against a villainous and power-hungry Thor, literally fighting on the moon against his own brother. In this battle, Loki now found himself worthy of wielding Mjolnir, even if he no longer properly felt like himself. Once everyone's alignments had returned to normal, Loki was hopeful he could still lift the hammer, but unfortunately, he's not quite earned that honor yet. Coming in at number 6, we've got the one who's potentially held the weapon the most after Thor, because she's a Thor as well. That's right, it's Jane Foster. During a time when the original Thor ODIN-SON was no longer considered worthy of wielding Mjolnir, the hammer was abandoned on Earth's moon and sent out a telepathic signal to Jane Foster, who is currently battling breast cancer while representing Earth at the Council of Worlds on Asgard. Jane found she was capable of wielding the hammer and hid her identity as she became a new Thor to protect the Nine Realms, even while still battling cancer every time she reverted to her human form. Talk about badass. At number 5, we've got a Spider-Man, but not the one you might be expecting. It's Spider-Man 2099 Miguel O'Hara. In the far future, at the end of the Marvel 2099 universe, after the planet Earth's destruction, the former Spider-Man of the future is gifted Mjolnir by a resurrected Steve Rogers and is shocked to discover he's capable of lifting the hammer. Instead of becoming a new version of Thor, Miguel uses the immortality that Mjolnir grants him to become a wise leader for humanity, bringing them back from the capitalistic brink that destroyed their planet in the first place. And by finding a creative way to save the world instead of the usual punching things back to normal, That's pretty freaking worthy, Miguel. Nice going. Coming in at number 4, no Mjolnir-themed list is complete without the beloved Beta Ray Bill. A Corbinite from the Burning Galaxy, Bill originally met Thor when his ship was picked up entering the Milky Way galaxy by S.H.I.E.L.D., and Nick Fury asked Thor to check it out. After being briefly knocked unconscious and separated from Mjolnir, Thor was astonished to wake up to Bill wielding Mjolnir and all of his powers, a worthy protector of his people, simply trying to defend some refugees. While eventually Thor would reclaim the original Mjolnir, Beta Ray Bill had such a big impact on the Marvel Universe and had utilized the hammer so well that he was gifted a replacement weapon known as Stormbreaker, made from the very same metal as Mjolnir in honor of his service. Good job, Beta Ray Bill. I really hope you show up in the MCU someday. At number 3, we've got a little bit of a plot twist with Gwenpool. One of the weirder characters from the entire Marvel Universe, which is honestly saying a lot, Gwendolyn Poole is originally from an alternate reality that just might be our own, before somehow getting sucked into the main Marvel Universe through a comic book and all of the fourth wall breaking knowledge that allows. Gwenpool's adventures are far more comedic and outlandish than most tales involving Mjolnir, so it makes sense that her utilization of the weapon might be a bit eccentric. Whenever Gwen used her fourth wall breaking powers to gain allies and weaponry from the Marvel's universe's past, she was able to break Mjolnir's worthiness rule by literally wearing the severed arm of Thor as a glove to wield the hammer with. I don't think that's exactly what Odin had in mind when he came up with the rules, but I guess it worked? Coming in at number 2, it's the Star-Spangled Man himself, Captain America. I remember waiting the entirety of the MCU to see Steve Rogers wield Mjolnir, and when it finally came, fans around the world were not disappointed to see one of the most iconic comic book moments ever play out on screen, and for good reason. When the Avengers are being attacked by the dark Egyptian god of death, Set, Captain America seems overwhelmed with the rest of the Avengers by the sheer amount of minions at Set's disposal. However, Steve's random attempt to grab at Mjolnir surprises him with the knowledge that he is worthy, and goes to show just how powerful Captain America can become. And in our top spot, we've got a surprise from an entirely different universe. It's Wonder Woman. During a massive crossover event called, fittingly enough, DC vs. Marvel, Mjolnir is blasted out of Thor's hands when he wins a battle against the hero Shazam. The weapon is then picked up by Wonder Woman after she reads the description, enhancing her already incredible powers and giving them a lightning-based kick. In fact, Diana was so honorable and worthy of Mjolnir that she immediately gave the weapon up, stating that it wasn't fair for her to continue fighting with such an increased power boost. And while the actual Thor might not be quite as noble when it comes to battles, him and Wonder Woman shared a smile when she handed the hammer back. I guess game recognizes game, God recognizes God. Coming in at number 10, we've got the time that Thor was left for dead adrift in space, as seen in the MCU film Avengers: Infinity War. Thor has a pretty brutal time during the 2 most recent Avengers movies, with Infinity War beginning with Thor having to watch both Loki and Heimdall die, and the Hulk be defeated by an intimidating new villain, Thanos. After this smackdown, Thor is left adrift in space with the remnants of the Asgardian refugee ship, something that would likely kill any human hero in the Marvel Universe, and yet Thor is able to survive until he conveniently bumps into the windshield of the Guardians of the Galaxy, showing that I guess Asgardians are just really good at holding their breath. Coming in at number 9, we have the time Malekith turned Thor's liver into broken glass, a magical punishment that makes me wince just thinking about it. Malekith might get a bad rap for his lackluster portrayal in the film Thor: The Dark World, but in the comics he's been a pain in Thor's side for generations, and in this case, I mean that pretty literally. During an event that saw multiple Thors from different points of his timeline fighting against the Dark Elves, Malekith used his magic to torture a young Thor, and claimed to have turned his liver into a mound of broken glass within his own body. Understandably, this upset Thor, and his response was to spit shards of glass into Malekith's face, which is probably the most badass way possible to respond to some heavy internal bleeding. Coming in at number 8, we have all the times that Thor has wrestled with the Hulk. Whether it's in comic books, animated television shows, or billion-dollar blockbusters, Thor has always been one of the few heroes capable of standing up to the strength of the Incredible Hulk. And this usually puts him into an awkward position whenever the Jade Giant inevitably goes on a rampage. Whether battling on the streets of Earth or the gladiator arenas of the planet Sakaar, Hulk and Thor will likely continue to test their strength against one another for many years to come. If only because Thor is one of the few people that can tank a green punch and keep on swinging. Coming in at number 7, we have the time Thor chose to tear out both of his eyes in pursuit of knowledge. Desperate for a way to prevent the destruction that would be caused by the Asgardian event of Ragnarok, Thor visited the Well of Mimir, where Odin had once given up his eye in exchange for forbidden knowledge. However, Thor was stunned after removing his eye to find that the well still would not fill with water for him, only to slowly realize that since his father had already sacrificed an eye, he would need to up the sacrifice in order to be granted knowledge. Thus, Thor did the extremely metal act of ripping out both of his eyeballs, and despite his now literal blindness, was able to see the proper path forward to save the entire Marvel Universe. Coming in at number 6, we have the multiple occasions that Thor has survived the power of the sun. As an Asgardian that's thousands of years old, Thor's adventures have spanned all across the cosmos, and have led to Thor being put in the most destructive situations possible more often than you'd think. While aiding Adam Warlock in the Infinity Watch, Thor found himself having to withstand the strength of a star going supernova, an explosion that left him dazed and confused in an unknown location, but still undeniably alive and uninjured. Combined with the times that Thor has shrugged off attacks that have claimed to be as powerful as multiple exploding suns, and the God of Thunder really has an impressive survival resume. Coming in at number 5, we have the Norse event of Ragnarok. An ancient prophecy spelling both doom and rebirth for every living being in Asgard, the concept of Ragnarok has been used for multiple events throughout Thor's lifetime, and even adapted into one of the best MCU films. In the comics, however, Thor spent many years attempting to prevent Ragnarok, and when Asgard was finally fated to be destroyed, Thor defied the gods who had created the Asgardians and destroyed the World Tree, ending the constant cycle of Ragnarok and relocating Asgard to float directly above the state of Oklahoma. Definitely an odd way to end a story about the end of the universe, but hey, at least Thor's still alive. Coming in at number 4, we have the time Thor was destroyed by, who else? The Destroyer. During the big relaunch of Thor's self-titled series during the late 90s, Thor once again had to face off against one of his earliest foes, the Destroyer, as it relentlessly attacked the rest of the Avengers. In a stunning twist for a first issue of a new series, Thor was actually killed by this version of the Destroyer and sent to the realm of Hell, where Thor had to bargain and fight his way out of his imprisonment to return to Earth and save the rest of the Avengers. Does it still count as survival if you actually did die, you just don't stay in the afterlife though? Who knows at this point in the Marvel Universe. Coming in at number 3, we have the time Thor was turned to glass and then shattered by Thanos. In the MCU films, Thor and Thanos built up quite the intense and personal rivalry over just a couple films, but their confrontation in the comics version of the Infinity Gauntlet storyline somehow managed to knock the God of Thunder even lower. Thanos' reality-warping powers were put to use during his final battle, and just when Thor seemed ready to bring his hammer down on Thanos' head, the God of Thunder was turned to glass and then shattered, a humiliating defeat against a villain who, at this point, had complete control of the laws of the universe. Better luck next team-up event, Thor. Coming in at number 2, we have Thor surviving 3 direct attacks from the celestial Arishem. If you've seen Marvel's Eternals in the past year, you know just how huge Arishem is, and with Celestials being some of the most powerful beings throughout the entire Marvel Universe, they are not creatures you want to mess with. However, after believing Arishem had killed his father Odin, Thor relentlessly attacked the Celestial with his hammer, refusing to back down even as Arishem brought his full strength down on him. finally claiming defeat by throwing the Celestial's own magical sword through his chest, even if by the end of this fight, Thor looked like his entire costume had been put through a shredder. And finally, coming in at our top spot, we have the time Thor survived the torture of the God Butcher for over 2 weeks. Gorr the God Butcher has been one of Thor's biggest foes for the last decade of comics, and this year we'll finally get to see the villain on screen portrayed by Christian Bale in the MCU film Thor Love and Thunder. In the comics, Gorr is attempting to murder every deity across the Marvel Universe, and after capturing a young Thor, boasts that even gods of torture can only last moments under his interrogation techniques. Amazingly, Thor held out against Gorr's torture for 17 days, before finally being able to free himself due to the arrival of his Viking allies. This scenario would scar Thor physically and mentally for many ages to come, but being able to survive the God Butcher for such a long time is something Thor should be truly proud of.
Number 10. Secret identity. First things first. When Jane Foster Thor first showed up on the scene, and for pretty much most of her story, a lot of people did not know that this was Jane Foster. The identity of the new female Thor was a mystery for most of the comic characters, and even for the fans. Rumors were around everywhere. Some thought it was Thor's mother, Freya. Some thought it could have been Enchantress. No one really knew, and it only made the situation more confusing when Thor and Jane Foster would appear at the same time as separate entities. But that was just the magic of Mjolnir. The whole thing wasn't a secret for too long, but it was a secret and it was fun while it lasted. Number 9. Cancer. A big part of this version of Thor is the fact that Jane Foster is on a ticking clock. In the comics, Jane has severe breast cancer that is killing her. While she is on chemotherapy treatment, the problem comes with the fact that every time she wields Mjolnir and becomes Thor, her body is purged of the chemo, effectively meaning being Thor is ending her faster. ODIN-SON has offered to use Asgardian magic to help her, but she refuses. This whole side to her character gives her a whole different level of complexity and humanity that the original ODIN-SON Thor never possessed, as well as giving the mighty Thor storyline a sense of urgency and finality. Number 8. ODIN-SON. For all the people who are wondering what in the name of Helheim happened to Dude Thor, don't worry. The classic old Thor ODIN-SON is still around, only after something was said to him by Nick Fury in Original Sin, he is now unworthy of lifting Mjolnir. Instead, he has the celestial defeating battle axe Jarnbjorn, his original weapon before Mjolnir, and he's also accompanied by a large mystical Asgardian goat named Tooth-Gnasher that can travel between the 10 realms. He plays a large part in the mighty Thor storyline and is a huge help and ally to Jane, even if he is depowered without Mjolnir, and even if their relationship has always been kinda on again off again. Hold mortal, Odin has informed me of your YouTube and its magical algorithm. I just wanted to give you the warm gratitude of Asgard on behalf of the mortals working at Top 10 Nerd for liking, commenting, and subscribing. Your wondrous support enables them to continue to create videos. Alright, onward to the next point. Number 7. Civil War. The introduction of Jane Foster Thor caused a pretty big divide in the Thor fanbase. There were a lot of people who hated it, and a lot of people who absolutely loved it. I think it's absolutely awesome. It's fresh, it's new, and she looks absolutely bad. I also love the classic Thor ODIN-SON as well, but Thor was a frog at one point, so what's wrong with him being a woman? The writer of Mighty Thor knew fans had this kind of divide, so in almost a parody of this, the citizens of Asgard are also in a heated debate about this new Thor. Half believe her to be a thief, and that she should not be in possession of the hammer. This includes people like Karl Borson and Odin, and the other half are in support of her, people like Freya and Sif and the Warriors 3. Number 6. Dr. Foster. One thing the MCU did to change the character of Jane Foster had to do with her profession. In the MCU, Jane Foster is an astrophysicist, and she studies extraterrestrial phenomena. In the comic books, Jane is a medical doctor in the ER. When she was first introduced back in the day, she was a nurse who worked alongside Dr. Donald Blake, who was the alter ego of Thor ODIN-SON in the beginning. And that's how their romantic relationship came to be. No one ever told them not to date your coworkers, huh? Number 5. God of Gods. The name Thor has been established in Mighty Thor as a title more so than a name. And to prove that point, our girl Jane has some incredible feats when she is wielding the hammer. One of the points I want to draw your attention to is when Jane Thor is captured by the Shi'ar Empire and taken to their gods Shara and Kithri and offered a challenge of the gods. The challenge offered by Shara and Kithri is is to see which god receives the most prayers when the mortals are in life or not so life situations. They unleash a massive tidal wave on the people of their own planet and see how many prayers they get. Jane uses her abilities to save the people and by extension received tons of prayers. In the end, she received less points but won the challenge as she even inspired other gods to be better. Number 4. Worthy since 78. Jane Foster wasn't only worthy in Mighty Thor. Nah. Far before that, way back in 1978 in What If number 10, Jane picked up the ancient magical hammer. Things were different then, so instead of just being called Thor, she was called Thordis. As Thordis, she defeats a bunch of Earth villains like Mr. Hyde, the Radioactive Man, and King Cobra. And then she defends Asgard from both Loki and an alien invasion. It gets kind of weird from here though. She ends up giving up the hammer to Donald Blake, she's elevated to god status, and she marries Odin. Thor ODIN-SON is paired up with Sif, which has always kind of sit well with me, but the Jane and Odin thing, I don't know, it's kind of icky to me. Number 3, sacrifice play. Oh, we talked about that impressive challenge of the god thing, right? Well, that wasn't nearly the most impressive thing. Have you ever heard of Mangog? Well, buckle up. The Mangog is the physical manifestation and sum total of the hatred of a billion beings from a race that was slaughtered by Odin. Mangog is practically unstoppable. Even Odin is terrified of him. In Mighty Thor, Mangog is unleashed by Shara and Kithri after the challenge to punish Thor and the other gods. The Mangog de-lifed Tooth Gnasher and defeated yet another version of Thor, War Thor, who was Volstagg. He then attacked Asgardia, defeating and blinding Heimdall, Freya in the Destroyer armor, and then began to pummel Odin and Thor ODIN-SON. Then Jane shows up. She can't defeat him with just force, so she throws him into the sun, which he somehow bounces back from the first time, and then she wraps him in the chains meant for Fenrir the Wolf, attaches it to the hammer Mjolnir, and threw that into the sun, which ended Mangog, the hammer itself, and Jane's life due to the cancer. Number 2 becomes Valkyrie. With Jane succumbing to her cancer, Thor, ODIN-SON, and Odin revived her using the god Tempest because of the sacrifice she has made to save the Asgardian people. She fought the Dark Elves in the War of the Realms story. She became the temporary ruler of Asgard in Frigga's place, and she even took up the Thor title again using the Ultimate Universe Mjolnir alongside Odin-SON Thor. But at the end of the storyline, the spirits of Brunhild and the fallen Valkyries appear to Jane and ask her to become the new Valkyrie, which she does. And now everyone who had an issue with her as Thor gets her as a different Asgardian hero. Let me know down below what you think of Jane as Valkyrie. I'm just glad she gets to stay as a hero. She did too much awesomeness to not get something. Number 1, Natalie Portman is dope. Last thing I want to talk about is the fact that Jane Foster is played by Academy Award winner Natalie Portman in the MCU. And if you saw the trailer, she still is going to be Jane Foster when she's wielding what looks like a reformed Mjolnir. I am ready. Did you see her arms? The muscle, my god. The last time we saw Natalie Portman's character was in Thor the Dark World. And well, I mean, 1, the movie sucked, and 2, her character was not given any kind of development. I think with Taika Waititi, her character will be given real development, depth, and purpose. And I know a hard-hitting Academy Award-winning actor like Natalie Portman could do something with a writer-director like that.